I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you to our event. This is the fourth or fifth in our series this semester on the 2024 election. So every week, on Tuesdays mostly, we'll have speakers, and I'll just remind you that actually next week we have a double header. On Tuesday, we have Liliana Mason coming, talking about radical partisanship. Perfect timing given the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And then on Wednesday, we have Terry Givens coming to talk about race and the election. So two really great speakers next week on Tuesday and Wednesday. But today, one other thing I should also announce, and that is we have our Constitution Day event today up in the Cub, or maybe out in the mall since the weather's nice. We'll be handing out free constitutions, so if you want a pocket constitution, make sure you go up there and get one of those. But today, we're very fortunate to have with us Seth Masket, who's a professor of political science and the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. His areas of expertise focus on political parties, campaigns and elections, Congress, and the state legislatures. He is the author of Learning from Loss, The Democrats 2016 to 2020, published by Cambridge University Press, as well as several other books on state and national political parties. Seth also writes for Politico, the Los Angeles Times, MSNBC, and many other media outlets regularly. He also maintains a popular Substack newsletter entitled Tusk, which covers his research on parties. He is currently working on a book on the 2024 Republican presidential nomination and the rise of conservative populism within the GOP. And he's also a senior visiting scholar at Vanderbilt University's Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. So join me now in welcoming Seth Masket to the podium.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited. I really appreciate this invitation. This is my first time to the school, even to this part of the country, and it's been lovely. So thank you all. So my work today, I've entitled this presentation, Still Trump's Party, How Local Republican Leaders Made Up Their Minds in the 2024 Presidential Nomination. This is part, as was mentioned, of an overall book project I'm working on right now on understanding sort of where the Republican Party is today, with a focus on what has happened this year so far, with a focus on the 2024 presidential nomination, but also using that as a window to understand really what's been happening to the party over the last roughly 3 decades, to just understand how it's changed, and how what it is now is not necessarily something that Donald Trump created. This was something that was changed over a longer period of time and resulted in a party that he would recognize as home long before he got interested in running for office. So just to give an idea what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to emphasize a kind of long-standing conservative populist tradition, and I'll explain that in some detail about what I mean by that. It's just sort of a set of beliefs that has really become the kind of the dominant faction within the Republican Party today. And my attempt to understand that focuses a lot on some work I've been doing with a series of interviews and surveys I've done of county party chairs all across the country. Kind of like the middle tier managers of the political party, to understand how their thoughts have been evolving. I look at their support for different candidates in the presidential race, starting in early 2023, to understand how they were thinking about candidates and how they were thinking about other political issues. I'll get into a little bit about, just what we can learn by following county party chairs, what they can tell us that other ways of following politics don't necessarily tell us. And I spend roughly, the last portion of this talk looking at what distinguishes Trump supporters within the Republican Party from other Republicans. And how that's really there's still sort of a very significant set of issues that really do discriminate between the two portions of the party. But before getting into that, I want to take us a little bit back in time. A little more than 30 years to talk about this gentleman. Hope you can see him there. It's a fellow named Pat Buchanan. If you do not remember him, Pat Buchanan was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. He also wrote a little while speeches for Ronald Reagan. He was a journalist, a columnist for many years. He was also on TV. He's one of the architects of CNN's crossfire style of political argument. He later was on MSNBC for many years. So very prominent conservative columnist and opinion maker. Also, he was a presidential candidate. He ran for president twice in 1992 and 1996 as a Republican. And in particular, in 1992, he ran for president challenging the president's sitting incumbent, George H.W. Bush. He was sort of challenging Bush, saying this man is too moderate. We need a much more conservative, much more populist version of what this party should stand for. And he didn't really win that much that year, but he got within 15 points of President Bush in the New Hampshire primary. And that freaked people out. Okay, that was scary to a lot of establishment Republicans, that this outsider could come so close. And he accrued a number of delegates that year and was ultimately given time to speak at the 1992 Republican convention that summer. And he gave what he was calling then the culture war speech. It was his attempt to articulate what he thought the Republican Party should be doing, what direction it should be moving. And it was a series of attacks on liberals. He did endorse President Bush that year, but he was really sort of, trying to say what the party should be standing for. And he said a number of things along the lines of the agenda that Clinton and Clinton, meaning Bill and Hillary Clinton, would impose on America: abortion on demand, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. That's change, all right. But that's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants. And it's not the kind of change we can abide in a nation we still call God's country. He added, there's a religious war going on for the soul of America. It is a cultural war. He said we must take back our cities, our culture, our country. Now, I've showed this speech to my students over the past year and tried to tell them that this was a fairly radical speech at the time, and they were like, this just sounds like Donald Trump with better grammar. Like, what's the big deal? And I said, I hear what you're saying. I assure you, back at the time, this was considered very out there. This was considered a very minority position. Just to give you, when he said the God's country line, this is the face Barbara Bush was making. She was a little freaked out. And it is important to see that this was very much the minority position at the time, and this got some very negative attention, this speech, but it also was very stirring, and some people really inspired to get involved in politics for it. Pat Buchanan ran again for president in 1996. Again, didn't do particularly well, but when he wrapped up his campaign, he gave a speech to his supporters, trying to rally them. And he said, within this party, a new party is being born even in this room tonight. God willing, we will be there at its birth, and one day the stone the builders rejected shall become the cornerstone. The argument I make in this work is that this is functionally what has happened, that this is, what he was trying to do has become the mainstream of the party. And that sort of, that more Reagan-Bush style outlook of republicanism is very much in the minority position today. As I argue, Donald Trump he kind of inherited this conservative populist tradition that Pat Buchanan and others were developing. What is that tradition? Well, it actually goes back a long ways in this country. It has never belonged to just one party, but it has really become much more common within Republican politics in the last few decades. Sort of a strongly anti-immigration set of beliefs. Usually it pitches itself as opposing illegal immigration, but sometimes under more scrutiny it's just generally opposed to immigration in general, particularly from the nation's southern border. It includes sort of conspiratorial views about a shadowy network of elites controlling institutions and ruining things for regular Americans or real Americans. Includes a set of beliefs about authoritarian views about leaders, how like good leaders should be kind of exempt from the rules the rest of us obey. Political violence may be acceptable in some circumstances, it argues. This populist tradition it's functionally like the opposite of pluralism. Okay, pluralism is the idea that there are lots of different legitimate views out there. The competition between them actually makes a better society for everyone. Populism is basically saying, no, there's really one right way to go, and everything else is kind of inherently corrupt and suspect. Okay, so how did I choose to study what was going on this year? As I mentioned, I spent a lot of time talking with county Republican Party chairs across the country. Here's me with just a few of them. That's a fellow named, literally his name is Will Rogers. He's the former chair of the Polk County, Iowa Republican Party. That's in Des Moines. Oops. He actually makes his own brandy. Really nice guy. This is a fellow who's the chair of a county in West Virginia. We spoke at the Republican convention this summer. There were a lot of people like this. The value, I think, of focusing on these county party chairs, as I've really kind of gotten the impression, they're kind of the workhorses of the party. They do a lot of uncompensated labor for the party. They do a lot of organization and run local meetings and recruit candidates for office, and help with fundraising and help with volunteerism. It's a lot of uncompensated work, and they play a really key role. Also importantly, they are very well connected. They follow politics a lot. They know what's going on. They pay attention really early. Is there any way to fix that? Or I'll just keep going. Importantly, presidential campaigns see them as important people. They reach out to them. Now, party chairs, they don't necessarily have the kind of power that we might associate with, like, Mayor Daley in Chicago 100 years ago or something like that, where they can just point to people and say that person's going to be a delegate, that person's going to be in the state assembly or anything. It's not quite like that. But they are well connected, and my impression is it's worth understanding them. They sort of have aspects of both the activist community and the party infrastructure. So there are something like 3,100 county equivalents across the United States. Almost every one of them has some type of Republican Party organization. With the help of a student, I was able to identify roughly 2,300 of them and their email addresses. And then I started doing a survey of them online starting in February of 2023. And so I would send out about 2,300 invitations to participate in the survey. Typically about 100 to 200 of these chairs would respond. That's not a great response rate. We're talking about like 5 to 10%. Honestly, that's pretty typical for elite level surveys. That's roughly what you're going to get. And it's enough that you can, make some useful inferences about what they mean. It's a pretty wide range of people I spoke to. So I'm making use of that. But I would ask them questions about their support for different candidates. I would ask them questions about just how they're sort of feeling about politics in general.
I'll get my tech guy.
Okay. If you're interested, I detail all this in my Substack called Tusk. You can find that at smotus.substack.com. It's free. That is the logo. My son designed that, and that's me typing it. Okay. So I want to go through just sort of some of the initial questions I was asking people in each wave of this survey. And so I started this again, February of 2023. I would send out a new survey every 2 months after that up to February of 2024. So I've got 7 waves of this survey. And I wanted to know, basically I wanted to ask them about their support for different Republican presidential candidates and see how that was evolving over time. And I want to ask that in a couple of different ways. The first way I did was just starting out by saying, who are you committed to? What candidate are you committed to at this point, or are you not committed to anyone? And I got some interesting answers. So here's what that looks like over time, starting back in February of 2023. Over here, what's interesting, this dotted line is those who said that they were not committed, okay? Either they felt it was inappropriate for them to be committed to a candidate, or they just hadn't made up their mind yet. But really, up until the middle of last year, about half of them said that they hadn't made up their mind. And also, interestingly, in that first wave, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis were roughly tied at a little below 20%. So, this is important to think about that time period. This is sort of shortly after the 2022 midterms. This is arguably Donald Trump's least popular moment. He was sort of being broadly blamed within the party for Republican underperformance in the midterm elections. They were not really sure if he should be standing for president going forward. And he was not actually all that popular at that point. By the next wave of the survey, by April, all of a sudden he's up substantially. DeSantis is down, as people who had already committed for DeSantis moved over to Trump. Because what had happened? Donald Trump got indicted just before that second wave of the survey. And then, of course, the indictments kept coming. Donald Trump's numbers steadily go up. DeSantis slowly loses steam. You see a bit of a rally for Nikki Haley as like the rest of the party, she becomes the only alternative, but that never amounts to all that much of a threat to Trump. Okay, so that's one way of looking at this question. I also asked it in a couple of different ways. I asked people, okay, regardless of who you're committed to, who are you open to? Who would you, who would you consider as a presidential candidate? And what would happen is that I would give them a list of all the presidential candidates running at that point and say they could click as many names as they want. Who are you at least considering? And that was kind of interesting because actually Ron DeSantis was at the top of this list for much of the year. More than 70% of chairs in the very first round said that they were at least open to DeSantis. And those numbers, trickled downward but never lost all that much steam. Donald Trump, only around 40% were open to him initially, although those numbers slowly went up. You do see this kind of interesting trend from a few other candidates that they call like discovery, scrutiny, decline. That is, suddenly a candidate gets some attention, there's some interest in them, then there's some media scrutiny of them, and then people sort of lose interest. You see that with like Tim Scott, you see that with Vivek Ramaswamy, and a few other people. At the bottom, who no one's really considering, are people like Chris Christie, Mike Pence, basically the people who are running to be critical of Donald Trump. Folks who are just generally not interested in them. Then I asked kind of like the opposite of this question. I said, okay, regardless of who you're considering, who do you definitely not want to see as your party's nominee? And you kind of get the reverse of that. At the top of that list, of course, is Chris Christie. Everyone hates Chris. Every wave of the survey, he's at the top. No one wants him to be the nominee. You have Asa Hutchinson up there as well. Ramaswamy was doing okay for a while. Then the more he talked, the more people hated him. Interestingly, DeSantis remains fairly low on this measure. Again, a lot of people were considering him. Very few were ruling him out. In theory, had Donald Trump not been running, that's theoretically a very good position to be in. But there was really no way for him to really threaten the nomination from him. Okay. So those are kind of three different measures I'm playing with here. And what I was interested in doing is kind of comparing, what does this tell us if we're trying to follow and understand what's going to happen in a nomination contest? Just do not disturb this. Okay. So we can compare, support for county chairs. What does that tell us about what's going to happen in a nomination? We can compare that with some other things that we commonly look at when we're trying to understand presidential nominations. A lot of people focus on endorsements, okay? Endorsements by governors, endorsements by senators and others, that can tell us who's going to win a nomination. Coverage in the media, specifically for Republican candidates, their coverage on Fox News, that can tell us something about how much they're getting attention there, can tell us something about what kind of support they're going to get. Just looking at polling among Republican voters, that can tell us something. So I want to go through these different measures just briefly here. A lot of folks tend to look at endorsements as an important way of understanding what's going to happen in a presidential nomination. This is Senator Tim Scott, who was running for president, then bowed out and endorsed Donald Trump. That's generally considered a really big deal if someone who is running against you then endorses you. Endorsements can be useful. So this is an area where the website 538 has been really helpful over the last few cycles. One thing that they do is they keep track of who is endorsing whom. So they have this great database of senators, House members, governors, prominent state, local officials. When they come out and endorse a presidential candidate, they put their name in the big database and they assign a point value to that. And those numbers are arbitrary, but they're fairly useful to work with. So if a governor endorses you, that gives you 8 points. If a senator endorses you, that gives you 6 points, and so on. And we can see, and so basically whoever has the bulk of these points prior to the Iowa caucuses tends to win the nomination. It's not, doesn't happen every time. 2016 was weird that way. But most years, whoever's got the bulk of these endorsements tends to get the nomination. And when we see this is what Donald Trump's share looked like, he had this huge advantage in endorsements, which he did not in 2016. Not many people endorsed him that year. 2024, huge, with Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley coming in very distant second and third place. Suggesting that sort of party elites were very strongly behind him. So that tells us something. And what I did, I took those endorsement points that 538 created and just sort of aggregated them from week to week. Just see who's sort of winning each week in terms of endorsement points. It was never very close. Even notably in like late 2022, when Donald Trump was getting all this negative attention for the midterm elections, to the extent there's endorsements, they're going in his direction. He announces he's running for president. People run out and endorse him. You see it dip a little bit when Ron DeSantis and others announce for president, but he's never really threatened in this area. The bulk of endorsements are just remain his way. Then I want to talk a little bit about what we saw in media coverage. So the data from this come from a database called JDELT that tracks media attention on TV. And basically you can see this is coverage on Fox News when they were mentioning presidential candidates, what percentage of the time they were talking about different candidates. So they look a little squiggly from week to week, but overall, Donald Trump is getting the bulk of attention here. On average, about 70% of the time they mention a presidential candidate, they're mentioning Trump. That includes times when there are presidential debates going on that he's not in. Everyone else is participating. He's still getting about 70% of the attention. So he was very much the dominant story on Fox News throughout the year. We can look at polling. We got a similar story to what we got from the county chairs. You see that back in early 2023, this is Trump, this is DeSantis. Trump wasn't that far ahead of DeSantis. But again, the indictments start around here. Trump picks up. DeSantis drops. Literally, the smartest thing Donald Trump did for his campaign was to get indicted. The worst mistake Ron DeSantis made was Donald Trump got indicted. Those words don't make sense, but it's true. It never really changed after that. Trump just steadily accrued more and more support. Other candidates mostly lost theirs. Okay. So what I've tried to do, I'm going to throw a really messy graph at you here. I'm trying to put this all in the same space here. These are all different measures of support for Donald Trump in 2023 and early 24. The red line there is his share of endorsements. The wavy gray line is his share of coverage on Fox News. The blue line is his share of public opinion polls. And sort of the question is, well, what are we trying to predict here? The way I'm looking at this, when it came down to a two-person race between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley earlier this year, he got around 70% of the vote in those primaries and caucuses. It varied a lot from state to state, but on average he was getting about 71% of the vote. So which is coming closest to that? They all eventually converge around there. The endorsement share is kind of overstating it. It gives you, it says, it suggests far more support for him than was actually there. Polling was really kind of undershooting his position for a long time. The Fox News coverage is pretty good. On average, it's getting pretty close. It's around 70%. Let me throw in my other measures here. The percentage of chairs committed to Trump, obviously that's really understating his overall support in the party. This is the chairs considering Trump, which is closer. I then had that measure of chairs rejecting Trump. But if you take the inverse of that, okay, the inverse of chairs rejecting Trump, that is all the people who did not say they would not vote for Trump, that actually comes pretty close. And so how do we think about that? Basically, every chair who didn't say they've ruled out Donald Trump ended up backing him, right? That actually tells us a fair amount about where the party is, right? Unless they're strongly opposed to him, they're going to end up in his camp. So, it's hard to say what exactly the best indicator is. You want to talk to chairs, look at elite endorsements, news coverage, polling. The fact that you have, all these chairs who, the chairs who didn't say they wouldn't back him ended up backing him. It's a useful piece of information. Okay. I want to pivot from there to talk about what this work can tell us about, what distinguishes Republicans from these other Republicans here, from Donald Trump supporters. What can we tell within the party? And again, I want to come back to that populist conservative viewpoints that I was describing earlier. Again, a somewhat conspiratorial view toward politics, with a strong focus on immigration, some tolerance of violence to achieve political ends, authoritarian leadership preferences. I've also been playing with this other idea, like looking at the role of evangelical Christianity. And this is tricky because there's sort of a competing set of scholarship out there that's saying, well, this isn't necessarily about populism, this is about Christian nationalism. There's some overlap between these concepts, but they're not exactly the same. So I'm at least looking into this, trying to understand what's going on here. But one of the questions I asked these party chairs in the very first survey I did, I had a whole series of questions about their political views on things, borrowed from the American National Election Studies, from a number of other polling organizations. And so I wanted to get a sense of just their set of beliefs on a wide range of views. So I asked them, do you agree with the following statements? Okay. Do you agree that blacks face historic discrimination that keeps them from succeeding? Do you agree that women shouldn't complain about discrimination? Do you agree that the political system only works for insiders? Do you agree that schools and the media are lying to us to keep us from learning the truth? Do you agree that political violence is sometimes justified? Okay, this covers a number of different, obviously hot button areas: racial discrimination, gender discrimination, political paranoia or suspicion, and violence. And it's interesting to look both at sort of like the overall levels of the responses on this and how they divide up. So these are the party chairs I spoke to. Again, this is the very first wave of this survey. The darker lines represent those who were at the time not considering supporting Donald Trump. The whiter bars are those who were considering supporting Donald Trump. It's kind of interesting. If you look at these top few, very few people said blacks face historic discrimination. Very few people said women shouldn't complain. Not really much of a difference between Trump supporters and non-Trump supporters. Okay, they're pretty similar across lines there. We do see big differences among Trump supporters for these questions about the political system only works for insiders, the schools and media are lying to us. Okay, suddenly, Trump supporters are about 20 to 30 points more likely to agree with those statements, to agree with that sort of that kind of conspiratorial worldview. I'm pleased to report that basically no one said political violence is sometimes justified. Okay, in either group. That's actually very encouraging. That's an answer we want to see. Now, one thing I will add to this. So again, I was running this survey. I did this every 2 months, and a lot of the times a very similar group of people from one survey would show up for the next survey. So my first survey had nearly 200 people in it. By the last wave of this survey, there were still around 45 people from the original wave who were showing up in that one. So what's nice is that I can, that's not a huge number, but I can see how those people broke down. So I was asking people these questions in February of 2023. In 2024, I'm asking them questions like, how are you leaning between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley? And I can see how their views from a year earlier, translate to their candidate support a year later. So, for example, when I asked people, do you agree with this? The schools and the media are lying to us to keep us from learning the truth in early 2023. Well, we can see, projecting out a year later, people who agreed with that schools and the media are lying, they were overwhelmingly likely to be supporting Donald Trump a year later. If they disagreed with that, they were overwhelmingly leaning toward Nikki Haley a year later. Okay, that gives us an idea. This isn't too surprising, but it gives us an idea of how these views evolved. If you said the political system only works for insiders, well, again, if you agreed with that, you ended up very likely a Trump supporter a year later. Now, I know people had said that they had rejected the idea of political violence, but I wanted to probe that question a bit more. One thing I asked people in the initial wave of the survey was, how would you characterize what happened on January 6, 2021? okay? And I gave people 4 different descriptions of the people who participated in the rioting on January 6th. I said, were the people at the Capitol violent insurrectionists trying to overturn an election? Were they doing the right thing but shouldn't have been there in the first place? Was it that most participants were peaceful and patriotic, some bad apples went too far? Or was it that the people at the Capitol were patriotic protesters demonstrating for justice? And I noticed that, the further you go down, the more sympathetic it is to the people who are participating. So I wanted to see, how that broke down and what that told us about, candidate support a year later. So basically, if you were to say the people at the Capitol were violent insurrectionists, all those people ended up supporting Nikki Haley a year later, okay? If you were to give a more sympathetic view toward the people who participated, those people ended up supporting Donald Trump. Again, not terribly shocking, but it does sort of, suggest how these views led to their candidate preferences. Okay, another question I asked people, I asked about what issues they thought were important. I gave them a list of, a list of possible issues and asked them to rank them in terms of importance. The list included immigration, healthcare, the economy, political extremism, racism, climate change, and housing. And, so then this was in June of last year. And then looked to see, based on what they listed as their top issues, where they were leaning for in terms of candidates. Basically, so if they said immigration was the top issue, those people overwhelmingly were supportive of Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis at the time. If they were leaning toward other issues, they tended to support different candidates, but it just sort of suggests that, again, a lot of the support for Trump was people who were really focused on immigration, very consistent with the set of worldviews. And it's interesting to see how that sort of bore out over time. The Republican National Party's platform in 2016 did have some mention of immigration, but it was honestly kind of mixed. It was about halfway into the document, and it basically said, we discourage, we're against illegal immigration, we encourage legal migration, and welcome these people into our family. It was just, sort of kind of a mixed approach there. The Republican platform from this summer, literally the top 2 bullet points were seal the border, stop the migrant invasion, and carry out the largest deportation in American history. Okay, very different. The party really shifted very much on this topic, and it's sort of suggestive of what's happened in recent years. I mentioned talking about religion a little bit here. One thing that I found in these surveys is that, I asked chairs whether they, consider themselves evangelical Protestant. Those who call themselves evangelical Protestant were about 10 to 15% more supportive of Donald Trump than those who didn't. That was true in 2023. It was true in 2024. There's just sort of strong identification with him that doesn't necessarily tell us that much about Christian nationalist beliefs, but it's, still a useful piece of information there. Another one I thought was kind of interesting, I asked these chairs how long they had been their county chair. And it turns out that basically the longer they had been chair, the less supportive they were of Trump. Which is consistent with what we know a lot about the party, that those who have come into the party more recently are mostly motivated by their support for and defense of Donald Trump. Those who are, those who have been there longer tend to be, belong to an earlier version of the party. So there's this change going on within the party that is steering things more in his direction. One last bit of thing I want to get into here. I also asked people in the survey, when I asked them, what candidate are you committed to? And they gave a name. I said, can you, in a sentence or two, explain what it is that appeals to you about this person? And I was really surprised. About 90% of people who listed a candidate actually wrote something down. They wrote a sentence or two about why they were supporting the candidate. And so I went through these responses recently and was just sort of coding their responses to see what themes came up over and over again. For people who said that they were choosing Donald Trump, the themes that came up, a lot of them mentioned his first term accomplishments. Basically saying, I liked what he did when he was in office before, I want to see more of that going forward. Some of them said he was the best president in my lifetime. A few said he was the best president in American history. They were supporting him for that reason. A number said a version of he runs government like a business. They talked specifically about his economic skills. They thought the economy was strong because of his particular leadership. Several said he will save America. Several said they thought the 2020 election was stolen from him, and so he earned a new term in office for that. And then finally, a number of people said he is being persecuted. Okay, he's being persecuted by the media, by Democrats, by the Justice Department, and he deserves support for that reason. And it's interesting to see how these views evolved over time. So in the very first wave of the survey, overwhelmingly people were talking about his first term accomplishments. That was just, by far the biggest mention. Over time, more of these other things came in, but it was really the he's being persecuted theme was steadily increasing with time. By the last wave of the survey, he's being persecuted is essentially tied with his first term accomplishments. Okay, as more and more indictments mount up, that becomes increasingly the reason for people to support him. And just to give you an idea of what people were saying, the chairs that wrote, this is the stuff they were saying about persecution. One of them said, he is the one standing in the gap, taking the persecutions of the deep state, defending us, and he should be rewarded for it. Another one said, I was looking forward to the debates. The Republican field is mighty. However, the unfair media, the double standard, the attempts to keep Trump from running, folks, that told me he must prevail in the next election. Again, this idea that there actually was a competition there. People were considering other candidates, but when it came down to it, they ended up leaning toward Trump because they saw him under attack. Finally, someone added, anyone who is hated as much as he is must be a good guy. Okay. What can we conclude there? Well, my impression is Trump's nomination in 2024 was never that much in doubt. I think you could sort of imagine a world in which it didn't happen, but, almost everything became a reason for people to ultimately go back to supporting Trump. A lot of the county chairs I was following, like a lot of other party leaders, mostly were giving voters in their party what they wanted. They wanted to be there ahead of the voters. They weren't doing a ton of leading as leaders, but I think it's useful to follow them anyway. Again, this idea that anyone not initially opposed to Trump ended up supporting him, I think that's useful for understanding things. And importantly, what distinguishes Donald Trump supporters from others in this party was this conservative populist worldview that Pat Buchanan was talking about 30 years ago. And again, as he said, this was a minority faction. It is now the majority faction within the party. It is now the cornerstone. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off.
Yeah.
I'll ask you something we were talking about earlier, and that is there anything unique going on in the GOP when we compare what's happening with our right-wing party with other right-wing parties in Europe? So if you look at what's happening in Europe with Le Pen and Nigel Farage and others, is it just the same? Is Trump unique in some way, or is he just part of a broader trend going on?
Obviously there's things that are unique about him, but yeah, there is an overall movement going on. And it's not necessarily all that coordinated, but we do see versions of this going on in lots of different democracies around the world. It's going on in the UK. The fact that, Brexit and Trump's election occurred right around the same time tells us a lot about that. We've seen versions of this in Poland and versions of this elsewhere in Hungary. There was sort of this, and I'm focusing mostly on this research from a within American politics perspective, but it is hard to ignore this overall trend that's going on. It doesn't happen everywhere at the same time. Some places have proven a little more resilient to it than others, but nonetheless, there's obviously something, whether we want to consider it a cultural movement or a response to sort of economic trends or economic inequality, that just makes people more prone to this, or just it's just sort of a response to the overall democratic peace coming out of the Cold War. Slowly over time, these populist movements, which really had a bad name coming out of the middle of the 20th century, they lose some of the bad reputation as time goes on, and people start to see some charm to it. And populism has some seductive aspects to it, definitely. People who are critical. I mean, one thing that we do see in this country and elsewhere is just sort of overall declining approval ratings just for political institutions in general. People just less trustful of the media, less trustful of politicians, of courts, of banks, of you name it. And that's a great environment for these populist trends to thrive. But yeah, it does add that level of danger to it. Yeah. Back here.
Yeah. Do you think the Republican Party would be better off now with a different candidate, or does Donald Trump have like a special juice that energizes the voters?
It's hard to say, but I take the polling seriously that suggests that a different candidate would probably do better in general elections than he does. He's really quite unique in the sense that he has a really high floor and a low ceiling. That is, he'll probably not get above 47% of the vote or ever get below like 44% of the vote. And another candidate might just be different from that. There was polling earlier this year suggesting that, Trump was maybe roughly tied with Joe Biden, maybe would come a few points ahead of him. Nikki Haley would have beaten Biden by 10 points. I don't know if there was that much of a difference in reality, but yeah, he is good at getting his set of people to really turn out to vote. He also loses a lot of people in the middle. He's just never been that popular a person. So, and I do think a different candidate would have some ability to do that. Where his real strength is within Republican primaries, both when he's running and when he's endorsing other people. He has a lot of power there. And his support can really affect a lot of races, which is a large part of the reason they never really consider anyone else. He has that ability within the party. That's really important. You also have like a very polarized electorate where no matter who the nominee is, they're never going to lose that much. Pretty much all Republicans will back him. He may lose some people in the center, but we're not in a world where, like in 1984, where Mondale lost a ton of Democrats, or 64, where Goldwater lost a ton of Republicans. There's not going to be that much crossover anymore. Hope that answers your question. Yeah, over here.
Hi. Yeah. I was wondering, with what you said about Buchanan and having a minority in the party, and now it's a majority. I'm wondering with Trump allowing far-right extremists such as Nicholas Fuentes in 2022 and Laura Loomer now, right before the election, I was wondering if you think after Trump, do you think the party will shift even more right, or do you think it will go back to like a more moderate stance?
So the after Trump question is a really huge question, and I don't think we have a great sense of that. Unlike a lot of other leaders like him, Trump has not really pointed to an obvious heir. You could say that J.D. Vance is a version of it. I'm not convinced of that. I can imagine a version of Succession where his children knife each other for a chance to be the next leader. I can imagine some like Ramaswamy jumping in and saying he's the next obvious heir. One thing that I do think we get is that what we saw in some of those presidential debates last year where Trump didn't participate, there were like an hour here and there where they actually were not talking about Donald Trump. And you got a kind of a vision of what the post-Trump party looks like. It didn't look like the old Reagan-Bush coalition, like it's not going to snap back to that. But nor was it exactly like Trump's party. Like they were arguing about policy, they were discussing trade, they were discussing the role of China. It's further right, but you can imagine someone like Ron DeSantis being a big player in that party. You can imagine Nikki Haley made a strong showing for herself, and with Trump not there, I don't know that she wins, but she's at least more competitive. I don't think it stays exactly like him, and I don't know really who the leader of that. I think honestly it'll be several years of fighting before they figure it out. But there's not someone waiting to just take over that. A lot of people who have tried to sort of mimic his style it doesn't really go anywhere because they weren't household names with NBC shows for 40 years before that, right? It doesn't necessarily translate to other people all that well. So that's going to be a big mystery and kind of a bloodbath within the party for a few years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I understand I'm kind of asking you about the elephant in the room here, but could you speak a bit on what's driving the rise of populism and what their end goal may be with this?
I don't know that there necessarily is an end goal. I mean, the question about like what's driving populism around the world, there's a lot of things going on. Some of it is about economics, some of it is about race, some of it is about increasing migration, and some of it is about sort of just white status anxiety. I mean, these things are all sort of consistent with rises of populism. I've got some separate research in here that's trying to track at the county level, like where we see sort of populist takeovers of parties, and like some of it is about where, where the white residents feel threatened. Some of it is about just where there's more evangelical Protestants. Some of it is about a little less about the economy. So that it's a lot of things driving it. And one of the particular things about populism is that it doesn't come with a lot of very specific policy recommendations, right? Yes, close the border is a policy recommendation, but beyond that, it's fairly vague about things like the economy. It's fairly vague about a lot of other things. It doesn't have the kind of sort of programmatic approach that like conservative republicanism used to have, where it was like, well, we need to reduce welfare rolls, we need to reduce Social Security and things like that. It doesn't really support that. It's actually fairly fine with the welfare state as it is. So it's not really clear what the end goal is, but it's mostly to just say, whatever the elites are doing, we need to stop that. Okay? Whatever there's something wrong here and we just need to make it right. And that's a vision that Pat Buchanan was talking about, Ross Perot was talking about that, but it's really hard to satisfy. Even if you're doing it, populists can always say, well, that wasn't right, that seemed corrupt. And so there's always sort of justification for it going forward. Hope that answers your question. Okay, good. Yeah.
Could you talk to us a little bit about how the selection of people that are willing to talk to you might shape your analysis? I was noting in particular that the proportion of people saying they were evangelicals increases over time. Is that just because everyone else drops out of the sample, or is there something else going on?
I'm trying to remember that there. Yes, it does increase over time, you're right. I don't have a great sense of that. I don't know if that's overall numbers. It might just be that others are dropping out of the sample. This is something that I had worried about quite a bit going into this. Just who exactly is willing to talk to an academic? We know that there's a huge polling bias where Republicans and particularly Trump supporters are less likely to talk to academics, less likely to talk to pollsters. I was pleased to find that I did get a pretty wide range of views in my sample. It included a number of very strong Trump supporters. By the final waves of the samples, it was pretty similar to where a lot of pollsters were getting, just of Republican voters. I don't really have a great sense of what the overall universe of party chairs looks like, so it's hard to really gauge that. But this was an area where I've remained cognizant of it. I have remained. I've made a lot of efforts when I conduct interviews with people to try and get a pretty wide range of views and include a fair amount of Trump supporters in there. That has taken some work, right? So some folks I'll just like show up at events and they don't necessarily want to take my phone calls, but if I happen to be standing next to them at an event, it's easy to strike up a conversation. I had a great interview with the chair of the Iowa Republican Party a few years ago, only because his personal assistant was a student at Drake University and had a professor who said, "Oh, I know Masket. He's not going to screw you. You can talk to him." So like a lot of them sort of need some assurance. I've worked to just have some sort of reference point so that they know that I'm not going to use this against them. It's taken a lot of extra work to do that, but I'm reasonably confident in the sample I have here.
And you have to name the book Buchanan's Revenge, right? That's-
Well, I've been calling
I'll read the title.
I've been calling it The Elephants in the Room, plural. But yeah, I also, someone else wanted to call it Not Learning from Not Loss, just like, trying to echo my first book, but like, yeah, not really sure where that one's going. Yeah.
Is it irrelevant that one of the things that's getting a lot of publicity, of course, is about Supreme Court nominations and Roe versus Wade and all that? Is that related to populism, or is that something completely outside of that?
I don't know that I see that as related, to be honest. I mean, the idea of changing the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, that was a 40-year project within the Republican Party, or the broader Republican, or the broader conservative movement. This was something started by Moral Majority and others within the conservative movement in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Really, that's a long-term project to kind of take over a political party. I don't necessarily see that as populist. I mean, I'm sure a number of populists believe it or are on board with it, but I think it really predates this movement. So it's kind of a separate thing.
But nobody brought that up when you asked them why they like Trump or any of that stuff?
Almost no one mentioned that, which is really kind of fascinating.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And it was interesting because I've had conversations, some separate, very fascinating conversations, particularly with some evangelicals who really credit him with that. They and in interesting sort of transactional terms, they'd say, regardless of what his political or religious beliefs are, he's someone they can work with, and they recognize that. And he delivered for them on abortion in the way that previous pro-life candidates really didn't. But almost no one brought that up as a reason to be backing him, which is, as you mentioned, is pretty interesting. Yeah, Aviel.
Thank you so much. So, I think you're right? There was no chance that Trump was not going to win the nomination, but I think there's also popular sentiment that Trump sort of has a chokehold on the Republican Party establishment and that Trumpism has sort of taken over. And just looking at all of this data, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, right? Is the Republican Party sort of owned by Trump, right?
I mean, largely yes. I mean, I think, people have asked me, well, okay, what if he loses to Kamala Harris, and so they have yet another probably winnable election in which he costs them their election, who do they turn to after that? And as far as I'm concerned, the answer is he's the nominee for 2028. They've had so many opportunities to pivot from him, and they never seem interested in doing that. And so I don't know what happens after he dies, but I think while he's alive, he's interested in the job. He's basically in charge of the party. And the reason for that, I think, is like he's learned this sort of very old school political lesson of if you want to control a party, you control its nominations. And he does that. In a separate study, it's going to be part of this book, but some research I did with Mike Calburn and Rachel Bloom, we were trying to sort of measure Donald Trump's influence in Republican primaries. So we looked at the Republican primaries last summer for governor's elections, for Senate elections. When he endorsed someone, that person tended to do about 14 points better in the primary than when he didn't endorse someone. That's a huge impact. That's like a ridiculously large effect. Like almost nothing has that kind of impact on primaries. And other politicians, other Republican politicians recognize this. And so, some will push back on him here and there, but if they have a primary coming up, they know they can only push him so far, and they'll generally back down. So as long as he has that kind of influence among Republican primary voters, he's in charge of that party, as long as he wants it.
I was actually impressed that so many county chairs were not automatically committed to him again. I thought that was interesting, but you still think despite that he's in control.
I mean, I think, they were sort of looking, I think, like a lot of people in the party, they can imagine a world after he's lost interest in this, and they're thinking of other options. I think they weren't 100% sure he was going to run, or that he would go through with it. They were like, well, He might end up indicted, he might end up in prison. There's a lot of worlds in which he doesn't actually get from here to there. And they wanted to at least have a backup plan. But ultimately, yeah, as long as he was doing it,
We're gonna pull it.
yeah.
So Seth, we have time for one more question probably.
Okay, can we have a hand here?
Why is like the persecution complex so appealing to Trump voters? Because I mean, I watched the debate last week, and like the day after that, the first thing they all said was that it was 3-on-1, and it was biased against Trump, and so all of that didn't count. None of anything that was said, none of that counts because it was biased against Trump.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that comes up a lot. I mean, and this is interesting. This is one area where he is actually different from a lot of other populist leaders around the world. Which a lot of populist leaders, they complain that they said, look at how the world is stacked against you, right? And Trump says, look at how everything's stacked against me. He complains a lot about his own, poor me, everyone's against me. And his supporters sort of recognize that, oh yeah, this is the thing we're going with this, everything sucks for you. And we want to make it right for you. So in some ways they're just sort of mimicking his language when he complains about his own situation. But also there is kind of a leader rally effect here. I played with this a little bit. That really kind of fascinated me. If you look at support for approval ratings for Bill Clinton during his impeachment, okay, so it's that year, 1998, 1999, when he was actually under investigation, when the impeachment was starting, Bill Clinton's approval rating goes up by about 10 points. And then once he is finally cleared and exonerated by the Senate, his approval rating drops again. So there was sort of this sense, Democrats sort of had this moment where, our leader is under attack. Whether we agree with this attack or not, we have to defend our guy. And I think you see the same thing with Republicans and Trump. And I think Trump recognizes that. He tries to play it up. I think he realizes that, he will lose fewer people if he complains about that and say he's under attack. So I think there's a method to that. I think, but he also does simply like to complain about that.
All right, I'm afraid our time's up.
Okay.
Before we thank our guest, let me remind you, if you want a constitution, look for our interns who are going to be out in the mall or in the Cub. They'll be passing those out. And remember, next week we have Liliana Mason coming on Tuesday, same time, same place, talking about radical partisanship. She's done some really interesting research on why people become so rabid in their partisanship, they turn to violence. And then we have Terry Gibbons on Wednesday talking about race and the presidential election. But now join me in thanking Seth for really a fascinating